Element of ghosts here at Red Clay, Tamale. Welcome to the final day of the public program for the solo exhibition project by Ibrahim Mahama, which opened in Germany, Osnabrück, on July 8th. And ended. It opened with a public installation by Ibrahim Mahama from July 8th to October 1st, and we are continuing the exhibition in this form by traveling it from Germany to Ghana, Tamale specifically, and we are here. We've been here since 3 days ago. So we are grateful, thankful to all of you for joining us. This program was intended to further complicate and expand the aesthetic, political, historical, economic, cultural dimensions or scope of the project, because the project was dealing with three main things. It was participating in the bigger festivities of the 30th anniversary of the Künste der Welt Osnabrück, which falls this year. So the invitation to Ibrahim and myself and Bettina is, Bettina Klein is my co-curator. My name is Kwesi Ohene-Ayeh. And we were hoping that this program would do precisely that. So the 30th anniversary, and then it's also responding to the history of linen production and textiles production in that region of Germany, Osnabrück. So yesterday we listened to a lecture by Professor Klaus Weber and Dr. Thorsten Haizel, who are historians, economic historians, who took us through the routes, the specific commodities, the specific trade relations from a pan-European angle, and the objects which were traded between Germany and other European powers, and then eventually, traveled across the Atlantic to engage more commodities. So, through this, we are just generating a bigger resource or pool of resources which will contextualize Ibrahim's intervention in Osnabrück, so that we are able to do a lot more and have broader conversations that implicate art or that begin with art, but that transcend into different disciplines. Yesterday as well, we heard from Professor Akosia Adomako Ampofo, who took us through the criticalities of solidarity amongst other things. So we also saw interventions by Zora and her collaborators, Zora Opoku, the artist, and The Revival, who took us around, moved us around, and staged some gestural images for us to experience. So before I continue, I will just say Happy Farmers Day. Today is Farmers Day in Ghana, so Happy Farmers Day. I hear it's also World AIDS Day, so let us celebrate it. Yeah, so the project today, we want to take things a little bit, continue the programming with Gabriel Schimmeroth, who will have the first session this morning. We also have an exhibition that's opening later today. Priscilla Kennedy's work will move there. And we have a lecture also by Caricature Seidu, who will take us through his own perspectives. And Koliko will also help us with their work, which is more musical in form. So I'll introduce Gabriel, who is a curator, historian, and head of public programming at the Museum am Rothenbaum, Kulturen und Künste der Welt, MARKK in Hamburg, Germany. He is responsible for the experimental project space, Zwischenraum, a space between, and the project MARKK in Motion, which lasted from 2018 to 2023. And is part of the Initiative of Ethnological Collections of the German Federal Cultural Foundation. He was part of the interdisciplinary curatorial teams of the exhibitions Fleisch, which is flesh or meat, in 2018 at Altes Museum, Staatliche Museum to Berlin. Hey Hamburg, do you know Duala Manga Bell, which happened in 2021 at MARKK? An archive of experiences in 2022 with the Ghanaian artist Kelvin Haizel, which was part of the 8th Triennial of Photography Hamburg and curated, and Gabriel has curated numerous interventions and public programs. His main areas of interest reach from the urban history and the public infrastructures to the entanglements of museum, archives, and memory politics with contemporary art. This morning, Gabriel is speaking on the 21st century reflections on the peace of Westphalia, amongst other things. Shall we give Gabriel a round of applause to begin?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Kwesi, for this warm introduction. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at Red Clay in Tamale. It's a great honor. And I will organize my talk roughly in 3 parts. So firstly, talking about the war, the trauma of war and the myth-making cultural production around it. Secondly, I will briefly talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, the concept of sovereignty and the Westphalian system, which is huge, but also very contested implications on historiography, political science, and international relations. And lastly, linking it here in Ghana with the post-colonial moment of the late 1950s and 1960s. I will rely here on the Ethiopian-American scholar Adam Getachew and her recently published book, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, by offering a brief decentering of the idea of the Westphalian system, which came after empire, going beyond the Westphalian system and even talking about the idea of world making, which maybe could also be a starting point for further discussions here in Tamale. Before going into the topic, I feel a hesitation to talk so broadly about the 30 years of war, the Westphalian Treaty, the Westphalian system, and this is mainly because I want, of course, to avoid any link in nourishing the probably inevitable idea of master narrative, which we also heard yesterday about by Thorsten Hirse, is something every historian, curator should be very reflective upon. But also immediately because it is automatically lack precision. The idea is instead to present a more, and even this sounds a little bit strange in the context of war, a more playful or associative intellectual history which could be of interest here at the symposium. In the 2 presentations yesterday by Klaus Weber and Thorsten Hirse, it became clear and obvious that it is impossible to think domestic politics in isolation from global interactions. This is even, of course, more evident in the 19th or 20th century and quite frankly today. The Westphalian War is something which numerous political scientists and historians worked on. Quite lately, just around 5 years ago, the famous German political scientist Herfried Münkler made a around 800-page book, very comprehensive, and I will also rely in this presentation on research kind of brought together in this book. Starting with the war. So when the Protestant nobles toppled the governors of the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Ferdinand II from the windows of the Prague castle in May 23, 1618, no one could have guessed that this was what was about to begin. The longest war on German soil and the first even European war, in the full sense of the word. It is a history where the Swedish King Gustav Adolf and the great generals such as Wallenstein and Tilly were bringing in alliances. There were dramatic battles, unpredicted violence, and what is probably the most notable, the very devastated entire landscapes. And of course, the ending came by the peace treaties in Münster and Osnabrück. According to Münkler, it is also that this 30 years of war allows us to understand current wars, so the wars in the present, better than any later conflict. And yesterday, Klaus Weber was, when he was talking about the 30 years of war, he always spoke in the plural of it. And actually, this is also the more precise definition. So following today's research, it is not actually one 30 years of war, but actually there were 4 combined wars. So the first, the Bohemian-Palatine War, the Lower Saxon-Danish War, the Italian-Polish Interlude War, and then the Swedish War, which had the long-lasting influence on the German historical understanding, but also, yeah, it is kind of like more very present in the cultural production. I will give some examples later on it. So the Swedish War often is portrayed as kind of like a defense of the Protestant cause by the Swedish, but of course, and this is obvious in a way, it was never only about religion, but for example, the Swedish conquered Munich and kind of like the Catholic heartlands in Bavaria, and so this was it cannot be described as defensive. The memory of the 30 Years' War was kind of like the great trauma of the Germans until the trauma was replaced in the collective memory by the violence and destructions linked to the 2 world wars. So the devastation of the cities, the devastation of the country, mass deaths of the people in the years from 1618 to 1648 exemplified basically the horrors of the war. But it's also that this kind of explanation is always used as an example why German history took a different route compared to other European nations since the 17th century. So this is basically like the idea that Germany had become the stomping ground of the armies of those powers like France, Sweden, Spain. And in this form, it is the reason why the German nation was kind of like a belated nation among the Europeans. And so this kind of idea of the belated nation was always linked to the 30 Years of War, and of course also traced back to the confessional divisions of the country. So Germany took then this also very, in the historiography, important concept of Sonderweg or special path, and while other countries had a binding confession, prevailed like Catholicism in France or Protestantism in Sweden, Germany remained divided along these confessional lines, and even this is kind of, you can see it until today in Germany that it is a multi-confessional state with Protestant areas, Catholic areas under the Christian population. as a latecomer in this kind of political narrative, Germany had to conquer its place for inside the European power dynamic. And it is important that the unified wars by Prussia, so how the German nation then came about in the 19th century, it was always also seen as a revision of the results of the 30 Years' War. So also the violence inflicted on the Germans became a justification for violence now inflicted by the Germans of others. So because on German soil this is like the narrative, had to suffer during the 30 Years of War, they now can conquer France and Austria in this fight on the German question or the Danish. This trauma was anchored in the nation's collective memory, and it became basically the justification for this aggressive stance and the reception that such a war on German territory has to be avoided by all costs. Briefly mentioned at the beginning that the horrors of the First and Second World War then overshadowed and suppressed the horrors of the 30 Years' War, and also changed, of course, the German consciousness. However, in like Catholic historiography, the Swedish king Gustav Adolf appeared as the aggressor, or the Protestant history, the imperial policies of Spain played a comparable role. In principle, the decision on war and peace in this kind of Westphalian order then was later made to the interest of the states and not in reference anymore to this kind of religious obligations or values. And I think this is also something which we can take further on, because it's of course did not eliminate it, and we were talking about it also on the first day, war in any way, right? So the peace of Westphalia didn't lead to an end of war, but it lead to a different form of rationalizing it, calculating it. And so in a way you could argue it is contested, but you could argue that the rational calculation of war can end a war quicker than if kind of like identity, religion, ambition, greed for power, religious solidarities or so is intertwined with this kind of war, like it was in the 30 Years of War. The Peace of Westphalia laid the foundation of transforming this complexity of the order in peace. And in today's world, and this is also something where I will later talk a little bit about persons like Münkler, but also, for example, the German president were talking about it, wars in the Middle East, in the Maghreb region, or in the Sahel region can be used as an analytical tool to understand these. I want to first bring some examples of the question of trauma here, because like it is often described as like the trauma of the 30 Years' War of a form of tyranny, so including the forcing of to force someone's religion, to force someone to a special religion, the trauma of war, inflation, famine, hunger, and plagues. And this morning I was briefly talking with Anna about lullabies, one of the most famous melodies, basically, which in Germany commonly knows as Sleep, Little Child, Sleep, so Schlaf, Kindlein, Schlaf. And there are several versions which direct link, for example, to the Swedish War. And I also remember, basically by my grandparents, or a lot of Germans remember that they, in their childhood, came across these kind of like 30 Years War lullabies. And just to give, I mean, it's in our translation, obviously, but to give like the context of it, it's texts like, okay, the Swedish have come, took everything, broke the windows, carried the lead away, poured bullets out of it, and shot the peasants. Or the more kind of concrete thing with the May beetle, which is also linked then to the question of famine. May beetle fly, your father is at war, your mother is in Pomerania. Pomerania has burned down. and May Block Fly Away. And even in kind of like my generation, for example, idioms like Swedish fire behind Swedish curtains, which kind of is a description for being in jail or so, is quite something you learn or you grew up with without directly linking it to kind of like a concrete moment in history of the satiric world. It's just kind of like it's a normal way of speaking, and it's part of growing up in a way until today. Or even in kind of regions where there were important political figures, and what we learned about Osnabrück, where it is very central, this Steckenpferd story, where kind of like young kids going to the Rathaus in my hometown, for example. It was the German count of the city who kept the city out of the military conflict, and it is celebrated until today every year with a parade and so on. So kind of like this kind of history production around the 30 Years' War is kind of still relevant, I would argue, in Germany. Also, questions like around cultural production which came after the war, and basically being the moment of finding peace again, is very, very central. So one of the until now most important Protestant church songs, Go Out My Heart and Seek Joy, by kind of like one of the main Protestant church musicians, is something you roughly would say here in Protestant churches almost every Sunday. So it is, it's something which is kind of quite present. Or even until today, like the Protestant Church is organizing their diaspora work under actually the structure of in the early 19th century founded Gustav Adolf Werk, so named after the Swedish king who intervened in Germany for the so-called Protestant Church. There are several, and I think could go on for hours. Basically, there are several examples, like Grimmelshausen, one of the main description of happiness and unhappiness, where he's basically the great poet of the 30 Years of War, and he created figures like even Mutter Courage, which then also later, 200, 300 years later, were taken over by Bertolt Brecht, or kind of like poets like Andreas Gryphius, Schiller, the main German poet, and so they all kind of relied and worked on these questions. And you could even go along that even until kind of like best-selling authors of our time, persons like Daniel Kehlmann wrote a book on the 30 Years of War, and so on and so on. Briefly to talk about the treaty, and the concept of sovereignty. So, moreover, why delegates from several countries attended the Congress in Osnabrück and Münster, the treaties was actually only a proper agreement between only 3 parties, right? It is often consisted of 2 treaties signed in October 48, one in Münster, one in Osnabrück, and large parts were basically the same. So one was between the Holy Roman Empire and the Queen of Sweden, and the other one was the Holy Roman Empire and the King of France. And so large portions of these treaties are in a way identical, and they basically talk about the internal affairs of this empire. And apart from this, the treaties are also concerned with certain territories awarded to France and Sweden. So what we know, for example, the Pomerania, the cut between Pomerania is kind of like, even until today, the state of Pomerania is linked to these kind of borders linked through this war. And And what emerged out of this kind of like critique on the standard account of the 48 settlement was that that the 30 years of war on its nature was needed as kind of like the reprisal of the role and the concept of sovereignty. So this is something, and maybe also later when we can talk about sovereignty in the context of a post-empire world, this is something where there's constantly referring between this Eurocentric idea of the Westphalian system and maybe a non-Eurocentric idea coming out of anti-colonial struggle. So the sovereign state model was always been as kind of like a cognitive script. It was a basic rule, it was widely understood, but it was also, of course, frequently violated. So it is not that the sovereign state model was then after the treaty accepted, but it was basically with the treaty, it was always under pressure. And so according to this like standard view, the 30th War was always kind of like the war between two main parties, right? The Universalist actors with the emperor and the Spanish king, both from the Habsburg dynasty on the one hand, and then also kind of like loyal to the Church of Rome, to the Pope, and their opponents were more particularist actors, specifically Denmark, the Dutch Republic, partly also French, as well as the German princes, and these kind of like actors rejected this imperial overlordship and also, of course, the authority of the Pope, and were instead upholding the right of all states to full independence, which then led to the question of sovereignty. So maybe one few kind of more to complicate it a little bit more, that the kind of dichotomy between empire and sovereignty is nowadays, so also I would say since the 1990s, often seen as a false one. So the sovereignty question of the nation and the empire question, that this is kind of like a dichotomy is seen as something which is already kind of like changed, and there are new revolutionary basically phenomenons. And what is kind of like the basic idea of the Westphalian principles, and which is also part of what we understand as international law, it's firstly the government of each country is sovereign within its own territorial jurisdiction, and on the other hand, it shall not interfere with its other domestic interests. So so the Peace of Westphalia then in this case is traditionally attributed to kind of like the dignity of being the first of several attempts to establish something like a world unity order, and this is something which is definitely should be kind of like contested. So maybe now to kind of like bring it more to the questions which can be or should be also discussed in the context of Tamale here is the Westphalian order did not bring, of course, lasting peace to Europe. But what it did, it largely eliminated religious reasons for war, so the reasoning of war changed. And at least in the empire, this was kind of like an established wars as state wars for quite a long time. It's also lead to the replacement of mercenary armies and the creation of more like tax-funded armies, which also changed basically the outcome and the way how war were experienced by the population. And it is also kind of an interesting question if you could argue that today we are coming back into a form of, in a lot of parts of the world, to a new form of mercenary armies. And it's definitely something we know from Northern Africa or from the Middle East or from the Sahel region, that merchants are basically back in the political debates on how to fight wars. And it is clear that, I mean, obviously after the First and Second World War and the anti-colonial wars of liberation, all these principles of the Westphalian order are called into question. When Frank-Walter Steinmeier declared that the new peace of Westphalia is needed for the Middle East, it is something where Kwesi and Bettina were also kind of like linking to during their opening in Osnabrück. It is interesting that this kind of Westphalian peace treaty actually did not lead to a lasting peace, right? So there were wars over and over again, but it just changed like the structure of how the actors treat each other. And this is what I would love to bring now in, kind of like trying to wrap it up and bringing in, kind of like a jump into the 20th century and what I was referring at the beginning about the anti-colonial nationalism, which we, for example, here in Ghana know mainly from a person like Kwame Nkrumah, and how this can be actually explained as a new form of world making. So that means that it should require juridical, political, economic institutions in the international realm and would secure non-domination. So the right of self-determination is often read as something, okay, the anti-colonial nationalists, they universalized the Westphalian regime of sovereignty. But to challenge this and to complicate this, Getachew was arguing that the anti-colonial account of self-determination actually marked a radical break away from the Eurocentric model of international society and established non-domination as a new and central idea of a post-imperialist world order. Rather than the idea of independent and equal states, to the legacy of Westphalia, Getachew is arguing we should understand the vision of international order as an anti-imperialism that went beyond the demand for the inclusion of new states and actually to imagine a new form of egalitarian world order. So, and I would like to end with this kind of like question of the retreating state in a way, in the global south, as well be maybe also in the global north, that it makes any form of non-domination in the international world order even impossible, and that the minimalist defense of the state is in a strange way resurrection of a Westphalian system by default. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriel. So the floor is open. We have about 20 minutes. We have time. So thank you again for continuing to complicate the premises of the show, you know. And yesterday, what Akosua did was to also usher us into ideas or, you know, thinking about emancipatory possibilities, because part of our interest with this program or with the show was also to, you know, to tap into the unconscious, violent, traumatic, you know, histories or the memories that have produced the realities we have inherited today, but at the same time, find ways of creating, you know, new possibilities out of this impossibility. So you have also kind of nudged us in that direction given us this very broad scope from the 17th century until today. So grateful. Any reflections, comments?
Thank you very much, Gabriel. It set my mind thinking in many directions. And this is not necessarily to you alone, it's to anyone. And when you talked about the retreating state, and I'm thinking of Tamale, like the Ghanaians here can correct me if I'm wrong, it's like the NGO capital of Ghana. Every possible non-governmental organization is here to do some kind of development, right? You see the cars, the four-wheel drives driving through the city. And we've had NGOs in Tamale for decades. And yet, the development, we're not seeing it. So it's like that. I mean, the state has retreated, obviously, and other players are supposed to do things. And I've been thinking a lot about the power of the creative arts. And I'm just pondering if all of you will be prophets for a moment, whether in the next years, this is where the power of change will be. I mean, in the last few years, we see all these competitions. Just today, Caricature sent me something. Somebody else also sent me something about all these amazing things artists are doing, pushing the boundaries of knowledge production, but also doing, quote unquote, very practical things in communities to sort of liberate people from something, right? Both developmentally, if you are thinking of water and roads and schools, but also, that mental emancipation. Do we see, or will the artists be co-opted into the system? So, yeah, that's my, will there be more space for those kinds of things? Maybe I'm just dreaming aloud, I guess. So, yeah.
Yeah. Are you responding to Agoja? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation, and thank you, Prof. Adumako, for asking that question. I think maybe you are not asking if we should be prophetic, but you are also prophesizing already that, probably the future to development lies in the hands of the creative arts or creative people. I mean, this edifice or this outfit or the network of outfits that Ibrahim has established already speak to some of these things you are saying. I think, myself and Kwesi, we belong to a collective, Exit Film Collective, and much as we dislike or we are suspicious of NGOs, I think in the Ghanaian statutes, as a collective, you cannot register if you do not present yourself as an NGO. And so we are actually registered as a non-for-profit organization just because there's no other category that captures us. So yes, we would continue to do things, but being very aware of the failure of the NGO model. As you said, the managers of these NGOs would always be the ones riding in big cars, whilst the thing they refer to as poverty porn, where the poverty must be maintained and must be sustained so that aid will continue coming. With the model we have here, the funds are expected to be generated from the activities here, not for the public to pay to enter, but through the work of the artist. And so yes, the emancipation then is within the work of the artist, but the artist is aware of the way in which the work is made to deal with the inconsistencies of capital, and then the emancipation then will come through the functions of the institution. And so, yes, so your prophecy is true and is working. My question, or my commentary on your presentation, Gabriel, is what you said about Germany's justification of inflicting violence on others because they had also received. And what do you speak, or what would you say also of the, because this idea that violence gives birth to violence is still persistent, isn't it? The current debate now with Israel and Palestine is also about this type of thing, that a certain body or a certain group feels almost entitled to wreak violence on another because they have had violence in the past. How, and then there's also calls for ceasefire and things. And if the peace of Westphalia did not bring lasting peace, how are we guaranteed that even if the ceasefire happens, there will continue to be peace? I hope you can deal with it. Thank you.
A very difficult question. I will.
But please, you don't have to answer.
Yeah, so I will answer shortly. I wanted to also say one sentence to the question of NGO, because the NGO is coming, like NGO in cultural arts or in kind of like humanitarian aid, is coming kind of late. And this is a quote I didn't include in the presentation, but I was yesterday talking briefly with Katja Seydoux about it, that it's a kind of like a paper from the 1980s, also on the question of how Africa is trapped. And it would be interesting how it is maybe seen today, but how Africa was trapped in the 1980s between the Westphalian concept of the nation state and the sovereignty, and the transnational concept of capitalism, and this kind of like didn't work together. So that the Westphalian system in a way inflicted also a lot of kind of pressure on the economic deprivation, and so on and so on. In regard to the question of what I said with Germany, or the Germany was arguing in the 19th century that that on German soil there were this kind of 30 years of war, and that's the reason why they now be able to fight the Danish, the Austrian, the French in the 19th century as a late coming of the nation state. This is, of course, and I mean, if we're looking at from today, also a form of propaganda or a question of history production, which then wanted to explain why the Prussian-led German state was in a form very aggressive, or seen as very aggressive. The linking what you then made to kind of like current debates in Israel-Palestine is kind of something which I would say is in this kind of specific course very different, because like I said in the beginning, the First and Second World War of the 20th century, they really transformed also the understanding of the 30 years of war. Right? It's this kind of like how I described it, and also how kind of like scholars like Münkler is describing it. It is more about how the Westphalian system and how the 30 years of war became such a trauma to the German nation. Why I talked about the kind of lullabies which are still on today, but there was also kind of like an understanding that something like this should not have happened again during the war. And it could be, for example, that even something like the Westphalian Peace Treaty in Germany in the 20th century, it was also linked that we should avoid on all costs that kind of like the war is going on inside the German areas, right? So this is also something which was always very, very present in it. And yeah, I think, I mean, it goes without saying that these kind of like, there are no forms of, okay, because of this war we can do this, or because we endured this we can do this. And also in kind of like history, maybe this is more like, I answered on a more theoretical level, kind of like history production is always going, when history is written, it's always written with the day, with yesterday evening in mind, right? So it is something which is constantly rewritten, and this also then lead to examples that you use kind of like historical experience to argue for something like this. But this is obviously not a you cannot bring in the concept of truth in it.
Yeah, I want you to develop that a little bit further. When you mentioned the world making with the contrasting the effects. So out of the Westphalian system, you have a Eurocentric model that has been operating in its own way, and then you have from the mid-century liberation movements, you have anti-colonial nationalist models, which also harking back to the Westphalian system in some way. How do you develop that contrast a little bit for us?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm mainly relying here on this very great book, World Making After Empire. And I think what is interesting in her perspective is there was, especially kind of like in international relations and in political science, a long-lasting conception that decolonization processes are basically buying into the Westphalian system. So we want to become sovereign states. We want to be present at the United Nations, or then before League of Nations. And in this kind of like concept, we creating independence and sovereignty and, yeah, frankly, decolonization. But her argument of world making, so world making, the definition of world making, what she's kind of doing is basically anti-colonial nationalism. So this is something like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, but you had several other, Tanzania, you had in the Caribbean also, processes like this. And in the Anglophone world, there was a moment that there was a different understanding of what kind of like the future world order should be. And the main argument was not participating in kind of like the United Nations as a sovereign state, or to be part with the sovereign nation in this kind of like international world order, but to create a new form of world order which is on the fundamental basis of non-domination. And I think this is very, very interesting. And I was reading when I was reading for this and reading a lot of articles for this presentation, even from the 1950s or late 1940s on, you have basically every 10 years, political science historians, politicians who were referring to the Westphalian system. This is really like it's an upcoming everlasting concept in a way. And even, for example, someone like Carl Schmitt, this kind of like important German theorist who's kind of like was one of the main influential figures in German fascism, but also got kind of like referred by Giorgio Agamben, for example, and so on. So it's a quite problematic scholar, and he was also referring on the Westphalian system. So this is something which is from basically the whole 20th century. The Westphalian system was very, very present, and to kind of understand the anti-colonial, the liberation, the decolonization processes, not as an attempt to be becoming part of a system, but actually changing it on a more fundamental level, is something which I thought also can be very fruitful for discussions. What an artwork by Ibrahim Mahama, maybe also like the whole idea of an anniversary of 375 years of the Westphalian Peace Treaty can actually mean for us today here in Ghana, but also more broadly. So that's the reason why I brought in her recently published book, because I think it was for me very it was a very hands-on non-Eurocentric approach to question of international relations.
Thank you, Gabriel. Do we have any more? We have room for one more. Okay. We are squarely on our break time, our lunch break time. So thank you once again. Please let's show some love to Gabriel. Thank you for coming, for offering us these critical reflections. We'll be back in an hour here. Then we listen to Priscilla Kennedy, who will take us through some of her thoughts, the processes. Eventually, we go with her to experience the work. Thank you.